Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Ayavadda. And this is the weekly monk chat, your opportunity to ask any questions related to Buddhism. And there's a chance that we might give useful answers. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then we'll go through questions. So if you want us to answer questions, please type them into the comments section and we'll respond to them as they appear. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello to the people who have checked in online. Hello to Gita, Norma, Jerry, Rick, Kim, Lydia, Joe, Maria, Alyssa, Louisa, Karuna, John, Jayanta, and Bhumika, and everyone else who's watching. Good to see all of you.
And also the live residents.
Yep, also the residents here at the monastery, yep. And Jerry says, please outline a general plan, or maybe two, for preventing the re-arising of previously abandoned unwholesome mental states. Well, first off, if you've successfully removed an unwholesome mental state in the past, then you can recollect, first off, that it's possible because you've done it before. Second, that it was beneficial. So recollecting how the mind feels better when that unwholesome state was removed. And third, remember whatever you did before that worked before. So often what we've done in the past is effective then and effective now. Not always, but often it works. In reality, often just recollecting the fact that you're capable of letting go of the unwholesome mind state, and the fact that you've done it before, and the fact that it was a positive experience, often that is actually enough to get the mind to drop it. And then recollecting whatever you did before and applying that strategy again, that tactic again, and seeing if it works again. That also can often resolve it. And if the problem persists even at that point, then it's time to start trying something new. So the very first recommendation the Buddha gives in the Vitakkasanthana Sutta is to direct the mind to something else that's wholesome. So deliberately think of something wholesome or point the mind towards something wholesome. So just interrupting the unwholesome activity and replacing it with something wholesome. And of course, the Vitakkasanthana Sutta has a total of 5 strategies listed, but you asked for only 1 or 2, so I think I'll leave it there. Do you have anything you want to add to that? Okay. And Joe says, he says, I learned a new technique to express gratitude. That's great. Says 1, give concrete info. Bhante Sudaso encouraged mindfulness of the body. Yeah, I do that extremely often. 2, share feeling, warm-hearted brightness. Okay, good. 3, explain what need was met. Bhante's kindfulness met a need for spiritual friendship and guidance on how to stabilize the practice of metta, grounded in the body, which reduces sensual dependence. Great. That all sounds wonderful. Sadhu.
Sadhu.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to, again, recollect the progress that we make in our practice, the successes that we have. And to remember what we've done in order to make progress in the path. So that really does help to build up our motivation and also keep us pointed towards awakening. Yeah, and definitely cultivating gratitude towards everyone who's helped us along the path. So if I start thinking of all the people who have helped me grow in my spiritual practice over the years, the list just stretches on and on and on. So of course, top of the list is my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, but then after that, the list just keeps going. There's so many names I could list. Even just thinking about it brightens the mind, all the people who've helped me over the years. So yeah, good to hear that you're working with the practice of gratitude. And let's see. Wise man says, a wise man say so. I think that's what that is spelled like. Says, how does one better deal with boredom? I find myself always needing to do something to stay busy. Any thoughts of how to better handle this? Venerable, what do you think?
Well, the typical advice that you'll receive, which is pretty good, is to investigate. Because usually boredom is when the most common way that we experience boredom. Actually, I won't tell you. I won't tell you the most common way. You should find out what is the way that you're experiencing boredom. Because if you're bored, well, that means that you basically are not interested in what you're doing, right? So what is that boredom and what is it really coming from? So I said a little bit, which is that the general feeling of boredom is we're not interested, but why? And also what? Because sometimes we experience something and we're like, oh, boredom, or oh, I'm anxious, or I'm angry, or I feel like this. But usually that initial reaction is built from a lot of previous built up habits and perceptions and feeling tones, both in the body and in the mind. And then we immediately come to have a feeling or some kind of label for what we're experiencing. So, we start to feel a little tiny sensation in the chest, and all of a sudden we're anxious, and it's the problem from our childhood 20 years ago. But that is a little bit quick. I don't know if that would pass in court. So we need to kind of put our mind a little bit to the test here. So the mind is saying boredom, boredom, case adjourned. And we need to say, wait a minute, what's really going on? And kind of investigate, okay, what is that? What am I actually experiencing? So investigate the first noble truth. So there's something going on, and it is dukkha. And you can't see the cat, but there is a cat present. If you have cats, that also might help with boredom. But if you don't, then go back to the Four Noble Truths. So the first noble truth is the truth of dukkha, the reality of dukkha. So first thing, what we need to do with dukkha, we need to fully know it. Parinyeya. So the Buddha said dukkha is to be parinyeya, fully known. And that means that how do we know something? Well, we develop awareness of it. We develop mindfulness of it. We develop interest and curiosity into it. So you develop interest, curiosity, awareness, and mindfulness of the experience of boredom, both in body and in mind. But really not just using Buddhist categories like, oh yeah, that's the form aggregate. And oh yeah, that's the, aggregate of this. And that's the external sound, ayatana. Like that's okay if you really know what you're doing, but really you should just be trying to come to a concrete understanding of what you are experiencing and how your mind is reacting to it, how your mind is labeling it. What is your mind doing to cause this? So that's the dukkha. And now we've already started to step into naturally. Once you see dukkha, naturally you'll start to see what is the arising of dukkha. What am I doing that's picking up and causing this dukkha to come into my experience? That's the second noble truth. And once you start to see that process, naturally the mind becomes dispassionate and it will start to be able to let go and gain freedom. So I would say apply the Four Noble Truths to the experience of boredom. And that's how you can stay busy. So if you find yourself needing to stay busy, well, stay busy by investigating the boredom and working with that. I think that can keep you busy for a while. And actually, if you keep it up, then eventually you'll become an arhat, because if you continue investigating your experience in terms of the Four Noble Truths, once you get past boredom, there'll just be another manifestation of dukkha to investigate. So eventually there's nothing left for you to let go of. So that would be my advice on that.
Okay, good. And Rick says, what does the Buddha say about how fear impedes or helps us to experience full liberation? Well, generally speaking, fear in the suttas is included as a form of mental bias or disturbance, which arises from delusion, arises from defilement and delusion, and which prevents us from responding appropriately. So when the mind is biased by fear, then we tend to make unwise decisions. We're not able to think clearly or perceive the situation clearly, and we're not able to properly control our actions. The one exception to this is to have a healthy fear of fueling one's own unwholesome states. So this is, even calling it fear is something I don't particularly like to do, but the Buddha says, how does it go? Anamatesu vajesu bhaya dasavi. So the word bhaya can mean either fear or danger. So anamatesu vajesu means regarding even small faults, small errors. And bhaya dasavi means seeing danger in even the smallest things, or seeing as fearful even the smallest errors. So what this means then is recognizing that any unwholesome conduct is something that we should see as dangerous, because it points the mind away from awakening. It distracts us from the spiritual path and can make the mind increasingly dukkha-ful. I got dukkha-ful.
Instead of uncomfortable.
Dukkha-ful. Yeah, I like dukkha-ful. I don't remember where I first heard that. It's a great word. Yeah, and also sometimes people talk about fear of unpleasant rebirth as something which also encourages them in their path. It's like, well, if I don't attain awakening and if I keep making bad karma, then I'm inevitably going to be born in a painful rebirth. So then fear of painful rebirth is something that can motivate one to commit oneself thoroughly to sincere practice. But generally speaking, when we talk about fear, we're talking about more a state of aversion towards an imagined unpleasant future of some sort. So fear of sickness, for example, or fear of pain, or fear of loss, or fear of not getting what we want. Well, all of that is just manifestations of desire and aversion and delusion. And none of that's the least bit useful. That's all just expressions of our defilements. Like, why are we afraid of losing something pleasant? Because we have desire and attachment. We have greed for that pleasant thing. Why are we afraid of experiencing something painful? Because we have aversion towards painful experiences. So normally fear is just a manifestation of our greed, hatred, and delusion. But we can, to some limited degree, turn that towards our benefit, as I mentioned earlier. So fear of dying unenlightened, fear of making our mind more dukkha-ful, fear of painful rebirth. These are things which can incline the mind towards awakening. And on that note, BC says, I recently read that if one is angry, they are suffering from avijja. Can you comment on the idea that anger is always preceded by ignorance or delusion, and if a life free of anger is possible?
Okay, well, in terms of commenting on the idea if anger is always preceded by ignorance or delusion, yes, in the Buddhist teachings, yes. So anger is one of the sometimes called unwholesome roots. And the way to understand this is related to what Bhante was saying just a moment ago about aversion and desire. So anger it's really a very coarse form of aversion, specifically kind of building up aversion in the mind into a complete mental state. So aversion it's really it is a mental state. That's one way of talking about it, but it can be very quick. It can also be very, very subtle. It can underlie things that we do. So we can even be happy and have aversion in the mind. But anger is really when we build aversion up and we kind of turn it into a whole aversion stew, and then that's what we're drinking in that moment. So we're really filled the mind with anger. So it also bleeds into our actions. So actually, one of the main ways the Buddha talked about anger is actually in relation to karma. So it's actually a thing that we're doing, or we're acting out of, you could say. So we create karma out of dosa, out of hatred. And so anger, because it's a manifestation of aversion, and it's a mental state that's built out of aversion and then acted out of strongly. Well, aversion is a form of craving. So it's wanting something to be different from what it is, or wanting something to not be present, right? So if we're like, for example, someone says something to us, they say, "I hate how your voice sounds," and you feel like you don't like what they said. You get offended. So you have a perception of your voice, and you don't like when someone says something that breaks or shatters the thing that you enjoy and have desire for, or you identify with. So you feel averse. And then you might build that up into a story and turn it into a mind really full of anger. And then you might say something back like, well, I really hate your voice, right? And so that all comes from identification. It comes from desire. It comes from not liking what's going on, i.e. wanting it to be different. And that is all built out of ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Ignorant that the fact that you get angry is a cause of suffering for yourself, right? Because why do we get angry? We want to protect what we love. Why do we want to protect what we love? Because it brings us happiness. So we really want to be happy, and we think that getting angry, well, we just have a habit of doing it to be happy. And so we're completely ignorant, not just intellectually, but emotionally, like within our wisdom, our heart or our mind is ignorant. And so it creates anger, and it causes suffering for ourselves. So if a life free of anger is possible, it would be possible by eradicating the causes of anger, which would be craving. Cause of craving is ignorance. And how do we eradicate ignorance? By the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view. Right view, for one, would be thinking anger is unwholesome. When anger arises, I should remove it, and I should prevent it from arising, and I should cultivate the opposite qualities from anger. And that's how you work towards that. And let me just notice. Yeah, so I think if that should answer your question sufficiently. And if there's anything else that was unclear, it's a big topic, but hopefully that's helpful.
Good. And Norma says, did the Buddha speak about space travel? Not really. Not in the way that we talk about it these days, anyway. So it's good to keep in mind the time and place the Buddha was in. So he was in a predominantly agricultural civilization 2,500 years ago, where even the concept of ordinary flight was not conceivable to people, let alone space travel. So I actually personally do think that since the Buddha was able to recollect tens of thousands of his own past lives, that he undoubtedly could recollect previous lives in previous universal cycles when humans had space travel, and the Buddha would therefore have known about space travel from past life recollection. But there would be no point in him talking about it because the people he was talking to would have no clue what he was talking about. So I think the Buddha actually was quite aware of the extent of technological advancement that's possible because he could remember it from past lives. But it would be completely incomprehensible to his audience at the time. So there would be no point in discussing it. There's a few little things here and there in the suttas which kind of hint that the Buddha is aware that technology could be way more advanced than it was at his time. But again, he didn't talk in any detail because he was trying to talk about Dhamma in a way that people could understand and relate to. So he mostly spoke in very down-to-earth ways. So again, he used a lot of metaphors around farming, a lot of metaphors around the military tactics of the time, or a lot of metaphors around animals and plants and things which people could touch and feel and see. So if the Buddha started talking about space travel, then people would just think that the Dhamma didn't make any sense.
If I could just briefly enter that, because I actually do have a space travel story from the suttas.
Oh, fun.
Sometimes called the world's first astronaut, but as Bhante said, I doubt it, is the story of Rohitasa. So there's this, actually it occurs in at least 2 suttas, possibly 3. So it's the same thing, basically repeated in different collections. So it's must have been a popular story. It's the story of Rohitasa, and he goes to the Buddha, and he says, in a past life, I had psychic powers, or I believe he said he was a deity or something. He said he was a god, and he had psychic powers, or he was maybe some kind of rishi. And he said that I wanted to see if I could travel to the end of the universe. And so I with the power of flight, like traveling in space, so it could be through a mind-made body. He decided to travel, just keep going. Like, I'm going to leave, and I'm just going to keep traveling through space and see what is the edge of the universe. And he said, I traveled for, I can't remember the exact time, but his entire lifespan, which was not short. So at least 100 years, possibly longer if he was a deity. And he said, I still never found it. And I just died. And then I never found the edge of the universe. And the Buddha says, long story short, the Buddha says, you can't find the edge of the universe that way. But I don't say that it's possible to make an end of suffering without finding the end of the universe. And he says, I say it's this fathom-long body with its perception and mind that is the universe in the training of the Noble One. And that we have to find the end of the universe right here. And then he teaches about the Four Noble Truths in terms of our experience of body-mind and how that is the whole universe. And he says that, yeah, that's how you find the end. So it's an interesting story about space travel. I recommend reading the Rohitasa Sutta.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. And Moraya says, I'm working to refine right speech and wondering if joking in a sarcastic way is considered wrong speech. Well, wrong speech is, it's defined in the detailed description of the Eightfold Path. It's defined in 4 ways. So there is deliberate false speech, so telling deliberate lies. So there's, divisive speech. So that means malicious tale-bearing, so malicious gossip. There is harsh speech or rough speech. So that's speaking in a way which is deliberately unpleasant for the other person. And again, there has to be the intention there of it being unpleasant or rough for the other person. And then the 4th one is useless speech. So just babbling on about worthless crap all the time. Basically, the way most people talk most of the time fits under the 4th category here. So the important thing with all 4 of these is the underlying intention. So when we tell a deliberate lie, it's deliberate because we know that we're telling a lie. When we're engaging in malicious gossip, it's malicious because we know that we're deliberately trying to set people against each other. When we're using harsh speech, we know that we're deliberately speaking in a way which is offensive or painful for other people. Again, with the intention of harming or upsetting them. And the 4th one, when we're engaging in useless speech, we know that it's useless speech and we're doing it anyway, even though it's useless. So again, the intention is the important thing here. So joking in a sarcastic way, well, it depends upon your intention. Why are you doing that? Is it beneficial or is it not beneficial? Is it helpful or is it harmful? So I've known several occasions when very advanced senior monks told jokes, including sarcastic jokes, and they would do so when it was relevant, when it was helpful, when it was beneficial to the people who heard it. So they wouldn't tell it as a way of hurting people or offending people. They wouldn't tell it just to make noise or draw attention or something like that. It was as a tool for helping to teach Dhamma. So I wouldn't say that jokes are inherently wrong speech. I wouldn't even say sarcasm is inherently wrong speech, but rather your intention is what makes it right speech or wrong speech. Okay. And Hasanta says, I heard a forest monk talk suggesting we should aim for mind emptiness instead of mindfulness. That's very cute. Yes, very cute. It rang true to my experience, but interested in your thoughts of this for samadhi. One of the critical characteristics of second jhana and on is that starting from second jhana, the mind is completely silent. There's no thoughts at all. There's no vitaka and vichara, which means the mind is completely silent. So yes, that is actually an aspect of samadhi practice, is that the mind is totally silent. I don't particularly like the word mind emptiness, because when we say like, oh, he's got an empty mind, it's usually not a very nice thing to say. But I like the pun that they're making. That's very cute. And Rick says, can you talk about how lay practitioners can set a pace that is supportive of practice and supportive of the ending of suffering? Venerable, what do you think?
Well, really depends on the lay practitioner. So when you say how lay practitioners can set a pace that's supportive of practice, I know lay people who I know a variety of lay people with a variety of lifestyles, and not all of them would be at the same pace. So I would say general principle on how to set a pace is you need to know your motivation and your aspiration. And I think as a layperson, that's actually really quite important. I mean, for everybody, but usually monastics who are practicing for liberation, it's quite clear that their motivation is liberation. But as a layperson, it's important to not set the bar too high and not set the bar too low. Because if someone, for instance, they want to be a layperson, they indulge in sensuality, they do activities that lay people do that monks would not do, but they also are pushing and forcing themselves to practice when they are practicing Dhamma as if they were full-time practitioners who were on the monastic kind of aspiration. That's not really, the Buddha never, we should make a choice on what we're doing. So that's not really going to be supportive, right? Of course, it's okay to practice, diligently, and it's okay to, for instance, be a layperson and also do very diligent practice, and that's why people do things like meditation retreats. But the mindset is really important. So when you do, for instance, a meditation retreat, whether on your own or in a monastery, usually people have the attitude of, oh, this is the time I'm setting aside for practice, and then I will go back to my lay life, right? But if you have the attitude of, I'm practicing for full liberation, I'm going to do this, you're pushing yourself in certain ways and you're expecting yourself and trying to live like a monastic in certain ways, but at the same time, you're also living a lay life and you're also tied up in lay life, that's going to be difficult. And it's actually something that a lot of Buddhist lay people struggle with, and they go through a phase at some point where they try to find this balance. So it's important to know what is your aspiration. So for one, why are you a layperson? Most of the time, the answer is going to be because you want to indulge in lay life, right? Some aspect of lay life. Sometimes there are other reasons, right? Sometimes it might be health, age, some kind of physical limitation or other limitations. But and in those cases, you might want to ask, okay, then again, what is your role in lay life? And set that clear in your mind and always be available to update it. But then once you have that aspiration, then you can start to form a plan, right? And so the first basic is obviously the 5 precepts. And I would recommend taking up the Uposatha practice. So that's something that the Buddha recommended. One of the stories is that he visited his home town or his home people, the Sakyans, and he asked them, so are you guys following the Uposatha? The 8-factored Uposatha, where once every fortnight, every lunar observance, could also be every lunar quarter, you take the 8 precepts. And they say, sometimes, we follow it sometimes. And he says, you should follow it all times. You should follow it every time that it's the lunar observance day. So he really pushed lay people. And actually, there's many, many suttas where the Buddha encouraged lay people. So That's the Buddha's advice. Step number 1. Follow the 8, well, first take the 3 refuges, follow the 5 precepts, and then every basically fortnight, on the lunar observance days, or it could also be every week on the lunar quarters, roughly, follow the 8 precepts. So that means not killing, not stealing, but also full chastity, so no sexual activity, not lying, not indulging in drugs and intoxicants that weaken our mindfulness, self-restraint, but then also not eating after solar noon. So you could also set a time, like I won't eat after this time, or I won't eat these specific times of day if you have dietary limitations where you must eat. Then also not using physical adornments or perfumes, or listening to entertainment, like listening to music or watching entertainment, like going to shows. Like don't go to the horse race that night, and abstaining from Netflix, abstaining from these types of modern forms of entertainment that people tend to use, singing and dancing and so forth. And then also sleep in a humble place. So for most people, this might not be a big difference, but if you want to, you could sleep on the floor. Some people, it's a reminder that they're following the 8 precepts. Or you could just maybe try not to indulge in sleep. So set a very clear limit. This is when I'm going to go to bed, and this is when I'm going to wake up, and sleep very simply, and just use sleep not as essential pleasure, but as a basic tool for rest. And so if you follow the 8 precepts, you can recollect also, for this day, I'm living just as the Arahants live. The Arahants do not kill. For this day, I will not kill, just like an Arahant. The Arahants, fully liberated beings who are free from the cycle of birth and death and have no greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind. These fully liberated beings, they don't entertain themselves with unnecessary entertainment. And for this whole day, I will not entertain myself. And so you have a whole day dedicated to study and practice. And once you get an idea of what it's like to follow the 8 precepts, you could up it. So see, okay, what is my aspiration? And the precepts can kind of start to match that, right? Because within the precepts kind of give us limits and room to be able to practice the Dhamma more freely. So they restrict us from things that might distract us, and they cultivate things that help our Dhamma practice. And so up the precepts. Maybe you follow the 8 precepts once a week. Maybe you decide to follow the precepts several times a week. Maybe you decide to take on the full precepts. And within those precepts, just continue to cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path. So yeah, that would be my general advice. Make an aspiration, and then try to cultivate a lifestyle around that, especially starting with the Uposatha. I think that's a really, really good way to get an idea that's very concrete.
Okay. And Mariah says, I have been feeling very badly about putting flea poison on my dog and lice poison in my daughter's hair. I also had a very bad ant infestation and eventually put bait down that killed the ants. I have a lot of remorse and fear now about what might happen because of how I killed these beings. What else could I have done in this situation so I don't need to repeat this in the future? Well, first off, it's good that you recognize that you did something unwholesome. So remorse is not a pleasant emotion, but it is an indication that your conscience is functioning. A lot of people are perfectly content to kill sentient beings that they find annoying. A lot of people actually don't see anything wrong with slaughtering other living beings that they find annoying. So we were talking earlier today, for example, about how a few decades ago in Cambodia, the Cambodian government decided to kill off all the Buddhist monks in the country because they saw them as problematic. So that's actually exactly the same attitude, which starts with just saying like, well, I don't like these insects on my dog, so I'm just going to kill them all. Well, in the same way, the Cambodian governor was like, well, I don't like these Buddhist monks, so I'm just going to kill them all. It's exactly the same mind. So it's good that you, even though the remorse and fear is uncomfortable, it's good that it means your conscience is working and you recognize that killing sentient beings is bad and not to be done. That's good. So make the firm resolution you're not going to do anything like that ever again. That's the first step. It's recognizing that the first precept is real. The first precept is extremely important, and it applies to beings of all sizes. So insects are people too. They want to live just like we do. They want to be happy and not be sad just like we do. So look for non-lethal ways of dealing with these sorts of problems. And you'll find that there are, in fact, lots of well-documented non-lethal ways of dealing with these problems. Our previous meditation center had a serious ant infestation. So we found non-lethal ways of dealing with it. Number one non-lethal way, by the way, is just to keep everything really clean, especially your kitchen needs to be absolutely spotless. That's the best way to keep ants away. Just don't give them anything to eat. Keep your kitchen spotless and they won't come around. As for fleas on your dog, well, again, there's non-lethal treatments for your dog fur that will keep insects away. I don't remember the details, but with our previous cat at one point had problems with insects in his fur. And I remember we did something with apple cider vinegar, which doesn't kill the insects, but it just repels them. So it makes they just don't want to live there. So that's one thing which I vaguely remember, but you need to look up the details because I don't remember. I just remember that it's possible. And with him, we had to do it because that cat was also allergic to the chemical flea medicines. So the poisons, by the way, are not just bad for the fleas, they're also bad for the dog. So keep that also in mind. As for lice poison in your daughter's hair, there's actually a very simple, non-lethal treatment for lice hair that people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. Shave your head. If there's no hair, there's no lice in the hair. Shave your daughter's head. Simple solution to a simple problem. Nobody needs to die.
Might feel like she's dying though.
No, people get over it. Hair grows back anyway. Plus, seriously, what is this bizarre obsession with hair? I really don't get it. Like, it's literally dead flesh hanging from your scalp. Why do people care so much about hair? And why are they so hesitant to cut off their hair? It's bloody insane.
Maybe you can record this clip and then play it for your daughter in case she gets lice.
Yeah. Like, especially like if your hair is a nest of like an insect infestation, why are you so attached to it? Let it go. But again, just as with fleas on the dog, there's also non-lethal ways of dealing with lice in the hair. So I can also recommend that. And Marielle, did you have something you wanted to say?
About many things, but in that topic specifically, if you cut off the hair,
Yeah.
the lice is gonna die.
No,
Not by your hand, but with time because it needs what it needs in your head. Like by itself, it cannot live. So it will be indirectly dead, wouldn't it?
So this actually gets into one of the differences between Jainism and Buddhism. So Jainism was another religion which was popular at the time and place of the Buddha. These days it's mostly died out, but it still exists in the world somewhat. And actually one of their practices was that they would deliberately let insects feed on their body. And they saw that as a way of cultivating compassion for small beings. So there's this cute thing that they would do is they would have a mattress full of bed bugs, and they would have like two Jain monks walking through town, and one of them would be ringing a bell and calling out, "Who will feed the bugs? Who will feed the bugs?" And then people would give a donation to the monks, and the monks would lie down on the mattress and let the bugs chew on them for a while. So that's kind of an extreme example of that. So if you're worried about it, well, then after you cut off your lice-infested hair, put it somewhere where the lice can live a relatively normal louse life for a while.
Then it will infect another being who is suffering out of that. Like, I wonder where does the line draws in the sense of like what stops being an animal or sentient beings and what is like perhaps a bacteria or like COVID who is a virus that lives and it needs to eat others and infect others to keep living. Like, where does the line draws in Buddhism towards what is like moral good conduct or not?
Yeah, so generally speaking in Buddhism, microbes are not classified as sentient beings. So they seem to fit more in the category of plant life. I guess. But like bacteria, we wouldn't consider to be sentient beings. What we see in the Vinaya, and this isn't a perfect guide, but we see in the Vinaya is it has to be large enough to see with your naked eye. So very small insects you can still see, just barely. Like they're the size of a grain of dust, but you can see them just barely. But things like microbes, including amoebas, for example, they're just way too small. So we're just, we presume they exist, but you can't actually directly see them without technological aids. And actually the fact is that your body right now is a gigantic colony of bacteria. The mere fact of living means that bacteria are dying by the millions just by the fact that you're alive. Yeah. So if we try to extend harmlessness also to microbes, then life becomes completely impossible. There's just no option.
So the line is drawn onto life.
So I'm pretty comfortable drawing the line at insects which you can see with the naked eye. Okay. I'm pretty comfortable drawing it there. A more delicate question is around things like intestinal parasites. So for example, tapeworms and parasites that live in your body. And so I've spoken to a number of monks about this, and most monks say that in that case, it's okay to get medical treatment, even though it's going to kill the parasites in your body. Mm-hmm. But you do so knowing that you are in fact generating some bad karma, but you're doing so for the sake of protecting your own life and health. But that's a bit more delicate and subtle of an issue. But in the case of something like lice in your hair, there's a million non-lethal solutions. There's no need to kill them. Fleas on your dog, again, non-lethal solutions. There's no need to kill. And as for what the lice or fleas do after you cut the hair or wash them away, well, that's their life. It's not up to you. Like people say, for example, when we sweep up the ants and put them outside, it's like, well, how do you know the ants are going to survive? We don't, but we're not deliberately killing them. We're just moving them from one place to another. So the intention is not to kill them. So similarly, if you have lice in your hair and you cut off your hair, you're not trying to kill the lice. You're just trying to remove them from your body. And you're trying to do so in as kind a way as possible. So parasitic beings they're actually living a life created by bad karma and a life in which they're mostly generating more bad karma. So we should only have compassion for those kinds of beings, like mosquitoes, for example. It's the product of bad karma to be born as a mosquito, and they are also constantly making more bad karma by attacking other sentient beings. So we should have only compassion for parasitic insects. Their life is not an enviable one. Okay. And Buddha, if you Thai person whose name I can't read because I don't know the Thai alphabet, says, please explain Khanda 5. Can you give a very brief explanation of the fifth Khanda?
Okay, yeah, so Khanda 5, Khanda number 5, is the Vijnana Khanda. So I don't want to use the word, the category of consciousness. So it's the entire category of phenomena, it's the entire category of all consciousness, whatever consciousness, whether past, present, future consciousness, very coarse consciousness, the most refined and subtle consciousness inside of you, consciousness outside in the external world, any consciousness whatsoever, sabbang vinyanang, netam mama nesohamasmi namesohatati eva metang yatabhutang samapanyaya dattabang, should be seen as it clearly is with wisdom. This is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself. That's how the Buddha kind of explains it. But what is consciousness? It's awareness. It's basically awareness of anything possible. One way of breaking it down that the Buddha gives is through the six senses. So awareness through the eye, awareness through the ear, nose, the tongue, things we feel with the body, and then the mind. But it's important to understand that when the Buddha gives that analysis, he's not saying like, oh, these are the six, only these consciousnesses. He's actually saying this is one way of breaking up all consciousness. So that's the short answer. Is it's awareness of any kind whatsoever, and one way of doing it is through the six senses.
Okay, thank you. And next we have a question. Dempson says, would you please elaborate on objectless bhavana or just sitting practice? Can one attain deep samadhi using this practice? So the best source of information I recommend for this is the books by Chan Master Sheng Yen, the founder of the Dharma Drum system. He gives some of the clearest explanations of objectless meditation or just sitting practice. He preferred the term silent illumination, which comes from one of the Chinese masters of the 12th or 13th century, Master Hongzhi, as I recall. Sorry, Hongzhi?
He's one of them.
Yeah,
He's used it.
Yeah. Yeah, briefly speaking, it's a form of combined samatha vipassana in which one practices letting go of all sankharas, letting go of all things, the illusion of separate persistent objects. And in so doing, then one can directly perceive the asankata dhatu, the pervasive element of objectlessness or formlessness or conditionlessness, which then allows one to recognize nibbana, to clearly see nibbana. So this is a very brief description. And can one attain deep samadhi? Yes, because it is in fact a samatha vipassana practice. So it will produce both deep samadhi and also profound wisdom. However, it's also a very subtle and difficult method, which is very easy to do incorrectly. Most of the time when people think they're doing just sitting practice, what they're doing is just wasting time or just spacing out. That's not what the Buddha was teaching. The Buddha was not teaching spacing out or wasting time. So with objectless meditation, the mind must be completely awake and clearly aware, while also completely silent and still, and letting go of all phenomena, not holding on to or reifying any aspect of one's experience. Jerry says, I thought the Buddha talked about a skywalker that could never reach the end of the universe. Yeah, there's the Rohitassa Sutta that Venerable Vadda mentioned earlier. Joe says, I was inspired today by recollecting an alt form of highest motivation for giving, as this is an ornament for the heart, as support for the heart. Is this an allowable change for mind? Yeah, I mean, in Buddhism, there's not really a sharp distinction between heart and mind. The two words are more or less interchangeable. Jay says, how does one skillfully use a nimitta? Even a fleeting one, sometimes a comical one. Yes, I think my mind is a troll. Yes, your mind is a troll. It's true. Your mind is, it's exactly like those people on the internet who like log into other people's message threads and type in utter garbage and like insulting remarks and random off-topic things and politically incorrect statements and whatever else. Like that's what your mind is doing all the time. Your mind is a forum troll. Yeah, so don't take it seriously. I remember there was an old internet saying, don't feed the trolls. Well, it's exactly the same for your mind. Don't feed the troll. Yep. As for skillfully using a nimitta, it depends what you mean by the word nimitta. So the way the word nimitta is used in the early Buddhist texts is very different from how it's used in the later medieval Apocrypha. So in the early Buddhist text, the word nimitta refers to whatever the mind is currently paying attention to. So whatever your current object of awareness or object of attention is, that's your nimitta. So right now, for example, I'm looking at the webcam, which is broadcasting this Dhamma talk. So right now, my nimitta is the webcam because that's what I'm looking at. Or if I look at this glass, then my nimitta is water glass. So during meditation, your nimitta then is your meditation object. If you're doing mindfulness of the body, then your body sensation is your nimitta. So skillful use of a nimitta means deciding what you're going to direct the mind towards, which is a suitable basis for samadhi or vipassana. So that's the skillful use of nimitta. It's choosing what you're going to direct your mind towards and directing your mind towards something that is the basis for the increasing of wholesome states. And Rick says, can you share some reflections on the skillful use of hiri and ottappa without falling into unwholesome shame, fear, or dread? Thank you. Do you want to talk a bit about hiri ottappa?
Sure. Yeah, well, it's important to understand that hiri ottappa, one of the translations is something like shame and moral dread or something like that, and different variations of that. But one of the things that I came across not too long ago is that probably the translation shame for hiri, well, it was probably first introduced, if I'm not mistaken, by one of the early scholars of Pali texts at the Pali Text Society. So this was a Western group that found Pali texts in Asia, and they thought, oh, we should translate these into languages, into English. And if you look in a dictionary from the 19th century, I believe it's probably around the 19th century, the word shame actually has a different meaning in English than what it does now. So nowadays, when we hear the word shame, it means like, well, shame. Just if you're a native English speaker, you know what it means. You should be ashamed of that. It's a sense of embarrassment. It's a sense of similar to guilt, and so forth. But actually, shame had a different nuance, which was really more a sense of more closer to conscience. So like a sense of knowing what's wrong and feeling like it's inappropriate to do something that's wrong. So hiri, it's used, for instance, for like if you're naked in public, then that the sense of hiri that arises, not the sense of like embarrassment that might arise in someone like, oh, I'm embarrassed to be naked, but the sense of it's not appropriate for me to show my private parts in public. So there's a sense of like it's not appropriate, and we try to cover it, right? So like let's imagine that your clothes are falling off in public. What do? Hopefully, you try to hold up your pants, or you try to hold up something, right? Like there's that feeling of like, oh, it would be inappropriate for me to allow this to be seen in public, right? So there's a sense of like something is inappropriate to be in this context, and I'm going to try. I have a sense that it's wrong, and I should try to protect that. So there's a sense of like consciousness and willingness and prudence to prevent something inappropriate. That's what hiri means, and it's actually used that way in outside of the more doctrinal context in Pali and also in Sanskrit. So hiri is this sense of like something's inappropriate, and we don't want to allow inappropriate things to happen. We would not want that to happen, and we would prevent it from happening. And then ottappa is similar, and it's a little bit too much to go into the details of that specific word, but it is also basically like we have a sense of distress and or of wanting to avoid the consequences of bad actions and wanting to avoid bad actions and what all of that entails. And there's a sense of like, oh, I don't want to go there. Like imagine a hot stove, and it's not necessarily inappropriate, but you have that sense of like, I don't want to touch that, and I'm going to protect myself from touching that, because if I do, it would be bad. It would cause pain. In the same way, we know if I do something bad, it will cause pain, whether in this life or in future lives. So we don't want to go there. So there's that sense of like of cautiousness. So that's what hiri ottappa is supposed to be. And when it starts getting to unwholesome shame and fear and dread, that's usually uddhacca kukucha, so restlessness and specifically remorse, kukucha, which literally means like having done something wrong, like feeling like bad, like remorseful. It could also be like I'm remorseful that I haven't done something yet, right? But it's that sense of remorse, which, as Bhante spoke of before, can be helpful if we don't have it. But hiri ottappa shouldn't be going there. And if it does, it's going into a hindrance usually. So try to build up the sense of like, what is it like when I don't want to touch a hot stove? Are you like, oh my God, I'm so afraid. I can't do that. Oh, I feel such a horrible person if I go near that. No, usually we just have this sense of, I won't do that because it will cause pain. So try to develop that attitude. Remember that perception. What does it feel like to not want to expose yourself in public and being prudent about it, and having that sense of conscience of what is right and wrong, and trying to protect good and prevent wrong, and that understanding that wrong causes harm and we don't want to go there. Develop that perception, and then try to nourish that in your actions by body, speech, and mind. So you can kind of try to equate those. That's not a perfect way because we don't necessarily have a perfect perception, but that's one recommendation I might give.
Great. And Tanik says, what is the difference between sankhara and cetana? Well, the word cetana has a very specific and precise meaning. And as far as I'm aware, it only ever is used in that one specific precise meaning in the suttas, and that is intention. So cetana is one's intention. Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you trying to accomplish? That's relatively clear and straightforward. Sankhara, on the other hand, is a word with a much broader spectrum of meaning. And the broadest spectrum of meaning of the word sankhara is sankhara refers to any distinct phenomenon. Anything. So a glass of water is a sankhara. A thought of anything, a memory is a sankhara. An emotion is a sankhara. The sense of shame is a sankhara. The plan to go to Disney World next week is a sankhara. Like everything is a sankhara. Every single thing, whether physical or mental, is a sankhara. That's the broadest usage of the word sankhara. And we see that in, for example, statements like sabbe sankhara anicca. All sankharas are impermanent, which you can translate simply as all things are impermanent. Everything is impermanent. So then the only conceivable aspect of reality, which is not a sankhara, the only is nibbana, which we can also call the asankata dhatu, which basically means the non-sankhara element, the only thing that's not a sankhara. So that's the broadest use of the word. Sankhara is also used in a somewhat more narrow sense of meaning specifically mental activities or mental processes or mental objects. And it's sometimes used in an even more narrow and specific sense of meaning mental decisions. And there's some overlap with the word cetana. But that final, like very narrow sense is not the most common usage that we find in the suttas. It's only used in that way in a handful of places. So normally the word sankhara is used in the broader sense of meaning either all distinct phenomena, or in the somewhat less broad, but still quite broad sense of meaning all mental activities and objects. So Norma says, if there is not me, not mine, not self, how can we be reborn, or who gets reborn? So Norma, congratulations on asking a question which approximately 400 million people have asked over the course of Buddhism. And I say that because there's about, let's see, how many Buddhists are currently alive in the world? 400 billion, 400 million. I think that's where it is these days, 500 million or so.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, basically everyone asked this question at some point or another. So I actually gave a very detailed talk on this a few years ago. If you look on the YouTube history, I think it's called Who Gets Reborn or What Gets Reborn or something. So I'd refer you back to that talk rather than just say the same things over again. Usually people ask those sorts of questions because they have a pre-existing belief that rebirth is not true. That's usually where that question is coming from. So I'd also ask yourself why you're asking that question. So Jay says, I was actually wondering about using a nimitta, a sign of the mind, to deepen my practice. Usually I will see it for a split second and instinctively come out of meditation. Well, then that's a really good sign that you shouldn't be focusing on it. So some mental object appears while you're meditating. Well, just keep focusing on your meditation object. The reason why you're coming out of your meditation is because you're moving attention from your meditation practice towards some random object that appeared in your mind. Yeah, that's just called getting distracted. Like, that's not meditating. That's just giving in to distraction. So my recommendation is to disregard whatever random mental objects are appearing in your mind. Whether you think they're nimittas or not, it's just random objects appearing in your mind. If you want good samadhi, stay with your meditation object. Don't shift your attention to whatever random things appear in your mind. Of course, that's going to make you come out of meditation. So Miss Leanite says, since Mariah didn't say what kind of school her daughter attends or how old she is, it might have been an act of heartless cruelty to force her daughter to get her head shaved. The daughter might have been shamed and exposed to merciless bullying. The use of the louse-killing shampoo was an act of compassion for her daughter, therefore mixed karma. That's all. No, that is not all. That is not all. So there's a lot of assumptions and speculation in what you said there. And murdering sentient beings is never an act of compassion. That's always an act of murdering. So mixed karma, yes, but it didn't need to be mixed karma. It could have been pure karma. Also, I really don't agree with this whole idea that we need to stigmatize shaved heads. Seriously, what's the big deal? Also, this whole genderizing of hair, of like girls must have long hair. Says who? I've known lots of females throughout my life who had short hair. I've known lots who had buzz cuts or even shaved heads. What's the big deal? Why are we genderizing these things? It's time to stop genderizing things that are not inherently gendered. And Paul says, how should I deal with endless distraction when meditating? Should I bring my attention to the distraction, or should I bring it back to the breath, or should I use another method? Well, generally speaking, stick with your meditation object. And if you're finding it really hard to stay with your meditation object, stick with it anyway. And if you're still finding it really hard, then you might see if there's a way you can make yourself interested, which sometimes means adjusting how you're relating to the meditation object in some way. And if that's still really not working and you've been trying for a while, then sometimes it's better to use a different meditation method. So I remember struggling for years to try to force myself to do breath meditation. And at some point, a senior monk compassionately advised that I do something different. It was the best advice I've ever been given in the field of meditation practice. If something's not working, then do something different. So give yourself that permission. If you've really been trying for months, you've really been trying to make yourself do breath meditation, it's really not working, well, then do something different. So we need to make a distinction between when you're just needlessly giving into distraction versus when you're actually trying to make yourself do something that's really not working for you. And Hasanta says, maybe you'd like to answer this since you mentioned Vijnana earlier. Hasanta says, does the negation of the concept of universal consciousness not imply that there is individual consciousness, i.e. us, even if we are not impermanent and we are suffering?
Permanent? Just a negation of the concept. Just a negation? I mean, it's a little bit of a confusing question, but I'll just get to what I understand from it. I would say that all consciousness is impermanent, and it doesn't really matter. Like, if you have a view that's causing you to think of, that's causing you to identify, well, then that's probably good to let go of that view, or to look at the, how is the identification arising from that view, right? So the word universal consciousness is not used by the Buddha. So also, like, having a problem with like this phrase in English is like, I don't know exactly where you've gotten it from, but I would say the Buddha never said universal consciousness. So like the implications of the English phrase don't really have any bearing on what the Buddha taught about consciousness. And yeah, the other thing to keep in mind just about this question of like, how, if things are outside of us and how does that relate, there implies there's an inside. The reality is that like the notion of self, anatta, the Buddha is saying that there's nothing permanent. So it's not worth calling that a self. So the Buddha still said like, oh, I went to the store, and he even said like, we tame ourselves. The wise tame themselves. And atta, the word atta. So the word atman, the wise tame their atman, or things like that. And so he's not the notion of like an individual. It's only problematic when it's reified into conceit of inferior, superior, equal, or the conceit of kind of I exist in relation to our experience. But like differentiating individuals is just a convention that needs to be done for effective communication, and also just for thinking in general. In order to even think, we have to have things to think about. So I wouldn't try to analyze too much kind of the philosophical implications of like nuanced statements. I would more just look at what are you taking as permanent, or what are you taking as kind of separate outside of your experience or within your experience that is who you are or is what someone else is, and working with that. And that includes awareness itself. So yeah, that's kind of how I would advise for this question, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Jojo says, I am addicted to distraction. You're not alone, Jojo. Now, Jojo says, I'm on my phone listening to something and I want to have more control over it. My Dhamma practice seems to be going well besides this. I'm glad your Dhamma practice is going well besides that. So I recommend look for apps that will lock your phone for designated periods of time, and decide that for a few hours every day, your phone is going to be locked. Then it just won't be a problem. And see what your life is like when you can't use your phone. It's great. Let me tell you, it's delightful. Rick says, chronic illness and lack of sleep frequently cause mental fog and a sluggish mind. How should I practice with this mind state? What do you think?
Mental fog and a sluggish mind. Well, I would say lack of sleep. Obviously, that's going to produce mental fog and a sluggish mind. So you should think to yourself, I haven't slept, so my brain is naturally going to be foggy and sluggish because the brain needs sleep, generally speaking, depending on the development of our mind, which is basically all of us need sleep. Even the Buddha would sleep. Even the Buddha would sometimes take naps. He wouldn't overindulge in sleep, but the point is that even if we have really, really developed minds, including the Buddha himself, still we might become fatigued. The body might become fatigued, and we might have lack of sleep, and that will cause the body to be more fatigued. And so you should just have compassion and understand, like, oh, my mind is sluggish and foggy because I haven't been able to sleep recently, and that could be due to the chronic illness, almost certainly, right? So really having compassion, kind of like if someone is limping and it's because their leg is hurt, it's like, well, how should I stop myself from limping with this hurt leg? And it's kind of, well, you should just understand that it's natural for you to limp if your leg is injured. So it's natural for the mind to limp with producing fog and sluggishness and confusion in the mind, if the conditions for confusion and fogginess in the mind are there from not sleeping. And so the mind state I would really try to develop is compassion, and compassion brings brightness and joy to the mind. Wink, wink. Brightness and joy is the opposite of mental fog and sluggishness. And also compassion and is kind of intertwined with loving kindness. And when you develop loving kindness, the Buddha says that you sleep well. And so then your mind will be bright and joyful, and then you'll have a nice, easeful sleep, and then you'll wake up even more bright and refreshed and joyful. And then you can rejoice in the Buddha's teachings and practice Dhamma nusati and Buddha nusati, and then you become more joyful. And then just before you know it, your mind might not be sluggish and foggy for a little bit. That's kind of a possible way that this could go. And you could do that gradually and in pieces. So I would try to develop joy and compassion and understanding and wisdom like experiential kind of awareness to understand that experience with kindfulness, and that should help automatically. And it's automatically your response will help the symptom itself. So that's what I would say.
And Garrett says, I had the insight that the ego is my biggest hindrance, being that it is the source of craving and clinging. That's correct. Does giving up self-view always lead to sotapanna? Yes, it does. Any advice? Yes, practice for the relinquishment of self-identity. That is Buddhism. Yep. And remember, it starts with generosity and kindness. I've noticed that all too often, convert Buddhists in particular, they're trying to do meditation practice to let go of self-identity, but they're missing out on the foundation. And without the foundation, you can't build a pinnacle. So without practicing generosity and kindness in your daily life, then you will never let go of self-identity. You will never let go of self-centeredness, no matter how much meditation you do.
It's also, I would just briefly say that it's good to look at what did the Buddha mean by ego or self-identity, because I just want to say that in a lot of spiritual traditions and also in modern psychology, the ego means something different. So in Buddhism, it's important because there's a lot of people who say like the ego is the problem. And yeah, it's important to know what did the Buddha mean by that.
Thank you. Yeah. And Julie says, can you speak about making determinations with respect to being free of anger? Is conceit related to anger, and how can we work through this as a determination? Well, determinations with respect to being free of anger. Well, one really, really important one is the determination to practice metta meditation every day. That makes an enormous difference, a world of difference. Over time, it does rehabituate the mind towards metta as a baseline, which then means that anger will come up less frequently and less intensely, and it will be easier to handle it when it does arise. So determination to practice metta every day. Next, determination to speak kindly and gently when interacting with others, and also to have kind and loving thoughts when thinking about others and also about yourself. So these also really deeply affect the tendency for anger to arise. The more we habituate the mind towards thinking, speaking, and acting with loving kindness, then the less the mind will incline towards anger in the first place. Constant mindfulness of the body also helps tremendously because then we're less likely to spiral into an anger cycle. We can catch the anger while it's still just a few sparks in the mind before it's a raging bonfire. And then when we do get angry, we should make the determination, I will not utter angry words, and I will not perform angry actions. I will settle and restrain and tame the mind before speaking or acting so that the anger doesn't poison my actions. That's also a very important determination. Is conceit related to anger? Yes. I mean, technically all defilements are related to conceit, because conceit is this attachment to belief in self-existence. So I am angry at that person for what they did. All of that is founded upon conceit. And Vivek says, how does meditating on the sensations of the body help us develop wisdom? Is there some deeper insight to these sensations? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Vivek, good to see you. And I know that you're a long-time Goenka practitioner. So I'm sure that you have a little bit of understanding about meditating on the sensations of the body to develop wisdom in terms of developing equanimity and letting go of craving towards, craving and aversion and so forth. So maybe I'll just say something a little bit different from what you've probably heard hundreds of times if you've been to these retreats and served them. Is one of the actually really most profound things in the Dhamma that the Buddha said and taught is that yang kinchi veditang sabbang dukkasmi, I believe is the phrase. So whatever is felt, all of that is included in dukkha. And actually, he admonished like really heavily one of the monks for saying this immediately to someone who asked about karma. And he was, so it's considered very profound, and it's ultimately related to the letting go of all Vedana, everything that is felt, which also means kind of everything that's experienced, because consciousness and feeling are completely inseparable. They're tied together. And that's also in the sutta. So we develop wisdom in relation to feelings by understanding the ultimate undesirability of all feelings. But we have to get there gradually. So meditating on the sensations of the body helps develop wisdom, first by, of course, developing equanimity and understanding how we tend to react to pleasure and pain, and how the body relates to that, and the mind and body relate. And that I'm sure you all have experience with, or you at least. But then once we go beyond that, the thing is that we have to develop joy. Sorry to break it to you. But the Buddhists, we have to develop joy in the mind. The mind has to become joyful. It has to go beyond the desire and the pleasure and gratification that comes from sensual pleasures by developing a higher joy. It has to. It's actually the eighth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. So by developing, meditating on the sensations of the body, we start to develop some equanimity. We start to develop some freedom, some spaciousness of mind. And we start to develop some stable, peaceful joy that comes from a still, bright mind. And then we start to cultivate that joy. But at a certain point, once we've perfected the joy, it can't be before we've perfected it, because then all we know is the coarser feelings. So we have to really understand all feelings. So once we develop the refined joy, we can start by meditating on the sensations of the body. Then we start to understand that even these refined feelings, they become more and more refined as the mind becomes more and more still and lets go of more and more coarse feelings, including joyful feelings. So first you start to let go of, like, I like this feeling, I don't like that feeling in my body. And you start to develop equanimity and stillness. And then the mind becomes joyful when it's very still and bright. And then you start to let go of some of the more coarse forms of joy within that. And the mind starts to become more peaceful, but not necessarily more joyful. In fact, the mind develops more towards equanimity, right? In the development of samadhi in the Buddhist teaching. So as you do that, even the equanimous feeling has to be let go of. And so we develop wisdom by seeing how feelings are more and more coarse. Some are more coarse than others, and some are more refined, and understanding the escape by letting go, until eventually we understand that all feeling itself is ultimately, it's more peaceful to let go of it. So that's kind of how we can start with the body, and then we move all the way to the end, but you have to start with something that we can observe and directly experience, which is the body. And that's it's the first obstacle that we have to get through. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And Joe says, I'm having an interesting experience with asubha and corpse contemplation. The more I practice, the more it seems that I have fast forward button and watch lustful thoughts turn to dust. Proper? I mean, that's not really enough information to go on, but generally speaking, if lust is decreasing, then generally speaking, that's a good thing. But there's not really enough information here to really say clearly if what you're doing is a good practice or not so good. But generally speaking, if lustful thoughts are diminishing, then that's usually a good sign. And Jen says, I'm torn between, is there anatta versus atman, because I cannot hold your breath. There's breathing, but is it mine? Your breath can't be mine. This is so confusing. Don't think of it as yours or mine. There's just breath. That's it. Just drop the whole me concept from it. So just observe the breath sensation that's happening. You don't need to think of it as this is my breath and I want to hold my breath. Just observe the breath experience that's happening. So it sounds to me like you're overthinking. So the experience of anatta sanya is an experience. It's not a concept or an idea, but rather it's when you directly observe that the experience that's currently happening is something which is the product of past conditions. It's a natural phenomenon, a natural result of causality. And even the decisions you're making now are conditioned by factors which are outside of your immediate control. So it doesn't change the fact that you are, in fact, making choices. Choices are being made. But nonetheless, whatever is within your field of experience can be seen as a natural, impersonal phenomenon, an expression of the laws of nature. So the breath that's occurring, well, it's not your breath. It doesn't belong to you. The body that you're observing, it's not your body. It's just part of the natural world. And usually the way that one approaches this is through the perception of impermanence. And the perception of impermanence naturally matures into the perception of non-self. So if you're finding yourself getting really hung up on the intellectualization of anatta, I recommend actually just focus on anicca. Don't even touch anatta for the time being. Just focus on developing the recognition of impermanence. And one day you will find that naturally you have a better sense of anatta. And it's because of the maturation of your anicca practice. That's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.